All right, welcome to our Wednesday night edition of the New York Giants Preservation Society meeting for today, March 29th, 2023. We have the great Rob Garratt here to discuss his new book, Jazz Age Giant, about Charles A. Stoneham in the Roaring Twenties in New York City. Before we get started, have to go over a few things. And Jim Folkerts wants to say a few words. Jim, the floor is yours before I make my announcements.
Okay, Gary, thanks. Listen, I just wanted to, as you can see, I'm sporting a shirt from the Giant Spring Training facility in Scottsdale. I just wanted to, so I did a van trip out there and spent about a couple of weeks in Arizona. And Gary was nice enough to forward an ask to the group about things to do in Phoenix. And to everybody, I just wanted to take a moment to thank everybody that replied to me. I mean, I was pleasantly overwhelmed with all the responses about places to eat, things to do, where to go, you know, where to park, things like that. I was really touched, and I just wanted to say, you know, thanks to everybody for that information. The best tip I got, one of the favorites was the Automobile Museum, because I met my girlfriend's family out there, her siblings, and they're not much for planning things. So I became the tour guide, and there's Martin's Automobile Museum out there, which is great because you can actually sit in the cars. So anyway, I just wanted to say thanks to everybody that replied. I really appreciated all the information, and I'll certainly use it again for future visits. So that's all I wanted to say. Thanks.
Thanks. Today, we took a walking tour of the Polo Grounds to get ready for opening day. Harvey, you want to just say a few words about it?
It was a great experience. The weather was terrific. John Miller and his wife, Sharp. John added just some wonderful comments to the whole thing. It was a lot of walking, and every stop on the tour was good, but I particularly liked when we stopped by Willie Mays's apartment, and one of the guys, is he here tonight? Is Ron here tonight, Gary?
No, he's not.
He's a guy who lives in the Polo Grounds apartment, and he came dressed for it, and he brought a stickball bat. I was talking about it in the before we went online, and it was just a great day. I'm exhausted, which a good exhaustion. A lot of stair climbing, step climbing, and it just couldn't have been better. It was wonderful.
Thank you, Harvey. We have a massive amount of pictures from today. I'm going to take them all, and I'll make a YouTube version of it. And you'll all be able to, I'll narrate it, not like Peter, the tour guide. Just I'll explain some of the pictures.
Yeah, Gary, let me add one thing.
Sure.
What I didn't know, did Peter come on?
Peter's on, he might be on the other screen. I don't see him here.
Peter, I didn't know. Peter revealed a secret that I didn't know, that Peter is a Dodger fan.
Well, we'll let him get away with that.
We were going to let him get away with that. And then he invited me on a tour. He was going to do a tour of the Ebbets Field area, to which I thought I was really being polite. I said, don't press your luck.
So
anyway,
I will.
Peter, I see that his name is there. Peter, you're terrific. Absolutely terrific.
Great day. So I will make a video of that on YouTube. Also, I did a one-on-one with Bruce Jenkins. Bruce was the last YouTube I had to do. We never recorded him, and he was nice enough to come on. He was fabulous, really great, and you should watch that. And of course, if you have not subscribed to the channel, please do so. I think it'll be worth your while. You'll get updates on when new stuff comes out, even though I send it out anyway. In 2 weeks, Paul Dixon will be speaking about his book, Leo DeRocha, Prodigal Son. It just came out in paperback. It's actually coming out in paperback next week. It was in hardcover a while back, but it's Paul's a great writer. He's done many other books, not sport books. So that should be a great night. In advance, happy opening day and happy Passover and Easter to you, because we will not be meeting next week because of the holiday. And without further ado, I'd love to turn the microphone over to a good friend of our group, Mr. Rob Garratt. Mr. Garratt, welcome back for the third time, and the floor is all yours. Give it
Thank
up
you
for
very
Rob
much,
Garratt.
Jay. Now, do we have the slides set up already?
I can do that for you right now.
Okay, maybe while you're doing that, I'll just say a word or two about Lyle Spatz, one of the people I met through my association with SABRE, and also with the 9 conference out in Tempe, which many of you might know about. It was just after I'd finished Home Team and was talking to Lyle, and I mentioned something about how I discovered Charles Stoneham, his story, while I was working on Horace Stoneham when he brought the team west in 1957 to San Francisco. I picked up things about Charles Stoneham, and I was just confessing to Gary or to Lyle. I said, wow, if I had a few more years, I'd really like to write on this fellow. He's so fascinating, and he's such a character, really, and a figure in New York City in the 1920s. And he said, well, why don't you do it? And I said, well, you know, it's going to be a lot of work. There's a lot of research and so on. And I don't know. I mean, I'm getting up there. And he said, take a look around this room. You'll be fine. You just get to work. So that was enough for me to try and get into this. So 6 years ago, I started to work on Stoneham after Home Team came out. And I started working with the newspapers in New York City, mainly. And then the Rupert family, Jamie and Kim, the granddaughters of Horace Stoneham, they gave me a lot of family material. And Jamie and Kim facilitated an interview with, this is really strange, but Charles Stoneham's daughter is still alive. She's 97 years old, and she lives down in Los Angeles. And both Kim and Jamie were able to get me there to meet her. And I had a long afternoon with her, talking about her father. So that was another great source of information. So let me say from the beginning, and this is by way of getting into talk today, this was a very mysterious fellow. Charles Stoneham made his money in the pre-war Wall Street, which was very unregulated. He took to investing in what was called the consolidated brokerage, or the curb market, as some people say, which was later called bucket shops. These were very risky, not very, completely unregulated, really. I mean, marginally regulated, if at all. And it was always, it attracted a younger and investor that isn't always, you know, as well-heeled as the standard Wall Street. You could get in with 10%. Often you could go in on a margin, and Stoneham took to this investing very easily and made a considerable amount of money. And by the time, I have a slide on this later, I just mentioned quickly, by the time he was in his late 20s, early 30s, he had opened about 13 or 14 Charles A. Stoneham investment companies all through the Northeast, including Boston, Philadelphia, Chicago, and of course, New York itself. So then the other thing was, because he was such a mysterious fellow, and a lot of the things he did, he tried to cover his tracks, leaving the biographer of such a man in a very difficult state. I decided to really look into the age, the 1920s, which is when he really flourished as a New York personality and as the owner of the Giants. And I allowed the age in a way to help me see into this very complicated individual, extremely interesting fellow. And so just on the outset, the complications of doing the work were for me quite challenging. And in the end, I try to always base everything I say about Stoneham with evidence. And in those places where I sort of infer what he might have been like. I do so only in character, trying to establish as much as possible what he might have done or might have said, given what I know about him after all this work and research. So with all of that in mind, maybe we could start with the first slide. I think you all can see it. Am I right, Gary? It's up on the screen.
Right now, we have the cover of the book. Do you want me to go
Okay.
to the next screen?
Yeah, next screen.
Sure. Move
Just to
this.
say that this is the era that I wanted to talk about. The 1920s were a very, very interesting and complicated historical epoch for American history. And as everybody in the room knows, I'm sure that Prohibition started in 1919. So the entire decade of the 20th century, of the 1920s, was somewhat of a contradiction. That is to say, if you go out and you participate in any revelry, which is nightclubs and so on, you're going against the law, and you may be a respectable individual by day, you're a party goer by night, you're breaking the law. And I did a lot of work on Prohibition and reading about it and looking at various descriptions by historians. And then next slide, please. And then I returned to the great seminal novel of the Jazz Age, published in 1925 by F. Scott Fitzgerald, The Great Gatsby. I'm sure most everyone in the room is familiar with the novel. One of the great readers of the novel suggested that it was a mistake. It's so well known, it's usually taught in English classes in high school, but it's for students really at a time when they're not prepared for it. And she was recommending that we read it again in an adult life, because it's really a window into what she calls the great American novel. The idea of aspiring, as you remember the story, Jay Gatsby, who comes out of nowhere, he's a working class, his background's mysterious. The source of his money is mysterious. He's apparently working in illicit bonds. He's a friend of the gangster Meyer Wolfsheim, who is based on Rothstein, A.R. Rothstein, the man who purportedly fixed the 1919 World Series. So Jay Gatsby is this fellow who kind of keeps his personal life aside, but he's got a tremendous amount of wealth. And his activities, the way he accumulates conspicuous consumption, yachts, racing cars, a big mansion, throwing lavish parties. This was his portrait. And what I saw in this was a prototype of the Jazz Age that Charles Stoneham could easily fit into. And I'll explain that as we go along. But the rereading of I read the novel 4 different times while I was writing the book. And it was remarkable for me what an insight Fitzgerald had into the age, and also for me as a biographer, how relevant his portrait of Jay Gatsby was in developing my portrait of Charles Stoneham. Okay, so let's go to the next slide, Gary, please.
Yeah, Rob, just one thing. I want to apologize. Some of the people could not get in tonight, so I was on the phone resending the link. I didn't want you to think I was not paying attention. Okay?
No problem. So what is of use, I guess, to this group, particularly since you are all really interested in the history of the New York Giants as a franchise? The New York Times carried a headline on January 15th. The Giants, it explained that this was a blockbuster deal. One of the price of $1 million for a franchise was just unheard of in those days. And maybe go to the next slide, please.
Sure.
And it was the offer was made by a group of people, one of whom was extremely well known to the New York sporting world. The man, John McGraw, you'll see him. Let's see, would it be on the right of the picture or the left? I never know when I'm looking at
This
something.
is John right
There
here.
he is, right there. And then on the far, whatever the other side is, left or right, is Francis X. McQuaid, who is a a judicial figure. He was a magistrate judge in New York City, but he was also very well appointed with Tammany Hall. So these are, and then of course in the middle is our man, Charles A. Stoneham, who at this period in his life was 42 years old. So if we can go to the next slide, I want to talk a little bit about how this reaction, I don't know if you can you read the quote? Can everybody see the full quote? Because I'm being blocked by a column.
I moved all the pictures over. Can everybody see that, or you want me to read it?
No, move the pictures, please. If you can.
That's as far as I can go.
Okay.
Gary, I can read it if you want.
Go ahead, Paul.
Stoneham was a stranger, even by reputation, to most, if not all, the baseball writers. They discovered after consulting their morgues, files and clippings on prominent persons, that he had been a broker on the curb market, but he owned a small stable of good racehorses, and that, although he had lived most of his life in Jersey City, was politically powerful in New York because of his close personal ties with Al Smith, Charles Murphy, Tom Foley, and other leading figures in Tammany Hall. Frank Graham, New York Sun.
Thank you, Paul.
So the background to this sale is that a man called Hempstead, who was basically John Brush died in 1912, and he left his control of the Giants to three different people: his wife, and then his two daughters, one of whom Hempstead had married. So Hempstead was more or less the person looking over and controlling for the Brush women their finances, and he was the head businessman of the National Exhibition Company, which was the umbrella organization of the New York Giants. And what happened in 1917 with the war is that it diminished the attendance quite severely for both the American League and the National League. And then in 1918, in April or May, they had a work or fight edict coming out of Washington, D.C., that all able-bodied men should join up. And indeed, 120 American League players and 109 National League players all enlisted, thereby diluting the quality of play and further restricting the attendance of the game. And Americans were turning away from the national pastime and becoming patriotic and so on. So baseball was really sinking. The attendance was pretty bad. The 1918 World Series drew very little in the 6-game series. And Hempstead was pretty convinced that baseball was not a good investment, and indeed it might not even survive. A number of sports writers were saying that the people have lost interest in the game, and it may just be a recreational thing now. So he more or less put out a little notice to the people in the front office, and one of them was John McGraw, that he's going to sell the club. And McGraw took a lead in this and went out to try and find somebody that would buy the team. McGraw was really the public face of the franchise. He'd been with the team since 1902 and was the manager for that period of time. And he'd always wanted to have a small ownership of the Giants. He wanted to be more than just a manager. So he went out looking for various people to make him fulfill this great wish he had. And he settled on a man called Loft, who was a congressman from New York, and he also ran a big candy company. And the other man that he settled on was George Cohan, the Broadway music man. And it was apparent, the press, more or less by the end of the year and the beginning of January, New Year, 1919, they almost, the inside track, according to all the gossip, was that Cohen would be the new owner and McGraw was facilitating this. So imagine the surprise of all the people in New York City, including George Cohen, when they opened their newspapers to announce that they have sold this for the highest figure ever to somebody nobody knew anything about. Okay, so the next slide, please. So here he is in 1920, a man with quite a bit of money. He had risen, he left home, he lived in Jersey City, and he lived, his father died, and as the oldest son, he felt a great Irish American. He felt like he needed to help the family, and he was living with his mother. Even as a married man, Stoneham lived with his mother in the family home in Jersey City. He went off to Wall Street as a board boy, first of all, somebody who just posts the various accounts daily. And then he rose quickly. He took to it. He was an able mathematical thinker, and he took to the sort of gambling side of investment, taking a chance, taking a risk, doing your research, and so on. And he rose. It was a meteoric rise in the brokerage business. And by 1913, he started working in 1895, so on. And then by 1913, he was opening all these branches. And net worth in 1920 was $10 million, which in our terms would be, as you can see there, 158 million. He was not considered in the Forbes top 50 New York City wealthy people, but he was considered quite wealthy for his age and for his time. And this allowed him to invest in the Giants. He'd always wanted to be a full-time sportsman, he wanted to get out of the brokerage business, and he started in racing. In 1916 and 17, he established his own racing company. He bred horses, and he really wanted by 1919 to get out of the brokerage business altogether and get into the sports world. And this opportunity to buy the Giants, which is a complicated story. I go into it in great detail in the book, but for tonight, I think suffice it to say that it was a complicated sale made possible by some of his connections with Tammany Hall, but he managed to make the offer, and it was accepted by Hempstead. And the key to this is the next. See the next slide? No, okay. I'll I guess I left it down too far. But the key to the as far as McGraw was concerned, the key to the offer was that both McGraw and Francis McQuaid would be small stakeholders in this new triumphant ownership, with Stoneham having the bulk of the shares, and then both McQuaid and McGraw having a very minor role. But it satisfied McGraw's great dream that he would be an owner of the New York Giants. Okay, we'll go to the next slide. No, sorry. Let's stay with the Tammany Hall. Okay, now again, I'm not sure. I can't read it, but I'll just explain who these two are: Al Smith and Charles Murphy. Al Smith is probably a name well known to you. Maybe Charles Murphy's not. Charles Murphy was the head of the Tammany Hall for almost 30 years, and basically everything done in New York was done by Tammany through him. All the political, and it didn't hurt that. Stoneham grew up in Jersey City, and there were many Irish Americans. His mother was born in Dublin. His father was a first-generation Irish American who fought in the Civil War. So through his family, he met people in Jersey City, who then met people in New York, and he took advantage of his Irish American heritage to work his way out, and people became very connected to him. Tom Foley, who was a protege of Charles Murphy, who ran the Lower East Side part of New York City, was particularly helpful to Stoneham, steering clients to him, helping him when he got into any difficulties. And of course, knowing Francis McQuaid, who was also a Tammany figure, working him into the partnership, it was another reason why Stoneham was able to buy the team. But not all of Stoneham's, shall we say, acquaintances were upstart Tammany politician types and mayors. And he knew Jimmy Walker, of course, and Al Smith ran for president in 1928. These were, but he did. Next slide, please. But he was particularly connected to Arnold Rothstein. And Arnold Rothstein is a gangster figure who more or less was the crime figure of New York City for about 15 years. He, interestingly, F. Scott Fitzgerald bases the character of Meyer Wolfsheim, Gatsby's good friend, on Rothstein. And there's a famous passage in the novel where Jay Gatsby tells the narrator that this is the man that apparently fixed the 1919 World Series. Rothstein and Stoneham knew each other. Stoneham was later going to testify in court that they knew each other for over 25 years. There are a lot of rumors about how deeply their connection goes. Some of Rothstein's biographers have said that he was involved in some of Stoneham's investment companies. There was also a story that he helped facilitate the sale of the Giants, that he provided insurance for the Polo Grounds, that he and Stoneham were into bootlegging in the 1920s, and Stoneham had a casino that he owned down in Havana and a racetrack, and a lot of the Scotch whiskey that was coming from Britain went through Havana. Stoneham facilitated these. These are all based on the biographers. I haven't been able to establish without any doubts about these things, but they're certainly out in print, and people have explained this a number of ways. So this is all the kind of story about Stoneham's connection to Rothstein that is interesting. They were no doubt they were acquaintances. One of the most celebrated moments of Stoneham as a gambler, and he was known to be quite involved in gambling. Arnold Rothstein had what was called the floating crap game, later popularized in Guys and Dolls musical, the permanent floating crap game. Rothstein started this in 1911, and they would go to all the fancy hotels and just keep moving. And among them were all the movers and shakers of New York City, and Stoneham was one of the players there. And this was a VIP kind of group. So he knew Stoneham as early as 1911 or so when they were, and then the two of them got into racing together. Both of them had their own stables, and they raced all throughout New York City. And then in the summertime, they went up to Saratoga Springs. At Saratoga Springs, Rothstein had a casino, and one night somebody was making a run on the house, and Stoneham, like many wealthy New Yorkers, would go up there to escape the city in the summer in the heat, and also to take advantage of the gambling and racing that was going on up there. Stoneham was home, and he got a call from Rothstein saying, "I need $300,000. Can you send it over?" And you know, the idea of him, Stoneham, having $300 in cash is pretty phenomenal. But sure enough, he sends it over, and by the time some fellow was making a run on the house very successfully, and Rothstein needed more cash as a kind of insurance. And by the time the money arrived, I think the house had started to win back its holdings. But the idea that Stoneham had that kind of cash just in his summer house is pretty astounding. The other interesting story about Saratoga Springs and Rothstein is that another time Stoneham was unable to get out. He used to like to go to the casinos at night, and he was housebound. I think he had twisted an ankle or something. And he picked up the phone and called Rothstein and asked him what color came up on the roulette wheel last time. And Rothstein told him it was black. And he said, "Okay, put $70,000 on the red and I'll wait on the line." So this kind of betting was, this is one of those famous stories about betting over the phone with Rothstein. We'll take the next slide, please. This is going to be a little choppy. I mean, I'm trying to cover the book in about 35 minutes. So this is the famous Polo Grounds in 1920 that Stoneham inherited. And just to give you this group needs no explanation about this. I mean, I usually give this slide to people that don't know much about New York City baseball. So we can move on to the next slide. This is before, of course, that last slide you saw was before any of the famous renovations that took place when Stoneham, both Horace and Charles made. Now, this is an interesting part of the story. You'll see here the picture of the House of Lords, so named by a couple of the journalists, that these were the Lords of the Realm, and the most exclusive men's club in the country, the baseball owners. And deemed the House of Lords by a couple of baseball historians. Stoneham basically enters the House of Lords in 1919 with his purchase of the team. And there was a wonderful celebration of this change. The newspapers covered it in New York City, although they were quite perplexed as to who this fellow is. And this is there's Stoneham there.
No.
You might recognize Connie Mack and Bill Veck, and there's Ban Johnson. So you'll see Gary Herman is right here. You'll see a number of these people in 1919, 1920, but they were not sort of welcoming, is I guess the right word. Stoneham had a cool reception. These guys also did not know who he was. And the idea that this upstart with kind of shady money background could enter this distinguished group that they saw themselves as anyway. He was not welcome. He gave a big party to celebrate the new ownership 3 days after they met in New York City. All the owners met in New York City, and that Saturday in late January, he threw a big party, Gatsby-style party, by the way, at one of the hotels, and only Charles Ebbets and Gary Herman showed up. The rest of the House of Lords did not come, and whether that was a snub or a slight, it didn't bother Stoneham at all. He just kept, invited people. They wanted to come, they want to come. But it took him a little bit of time to sort of warm up to and become a baseball man. One of the things that the Lords did was to authorize John McGraw to be a voting member in the early years of Stoneham's membership with these owners, because that they perceived Stoneham as somebody who really didn't know baseball culture. But it wasn't, Stoneham was a quick study in almost everything he did. And it wasn't too long before, while McGraw would still come to the meetings, Stoneham was clearly a voting member and all of that, no problem. Okay, we go to the next slide. Now, this is 1922. And again, I apologize just because I can't see the whole picture, but if you notice, there's Frank McQuaid, certainly in Stoneham in the middle, and then John McGraw is Gary from my picture. He's being covered by, you can see his arm there, but at
Yeah,
any rate,
McGraw is on the far right, Stoneham in the middle, and McQuaid on the left.
Right. Now this, there's an entire chapter in the book devoted to these three fellows. Very peculiar kind of relationship between them, and particularly Frank McQuaid, who got quite obnoxious with Stoneham and began to take a real, he really had it in for Stoneham, and he had his own ideas about becoming a better, a bigger player. And this led to a lot of ill will among the owners, the three owners. McGraw eventually sided with Stoneham against McQuaid, and there was a famous lawsuit that lasted 4 or 5 years in 1928, where they basically ousted McQuaid as the treasurer of the club. But McQuaid countersued, and I can't get into all the details of it, but it was a very rancorous procedure that lasted all the way into 1934. Just 2 or 3 months before McGraw died. McGraw dies in the spring of 1934. They managed to have a resolution in early January where McQuaid lost out to both Stoneham and to McGraw, and he was out of the organization. But it's a colorful story. They were, as one of the attorneys said, these were the New York Giants were owned by a rough element. These were cursing men, drinking men, fighting men. And this was all in part of the testimony. So the New York tabloids really had a wonderful time following this, these trials, gave them a lot of fodder for their gossip columns. Okay, we go to the next slide, please. Now, Stoneham started out in baseball he had a wonderful soft landing and a wonderful, well, I shouldn't say that. There's another chapter about the difficulty when he got into baseball in 1919. It was considered by many baseball historians as baseball's darkest hour, because in 1920, all of the dirt, if you will, came out in a grand jury testimony in Chicago about the 1919 World Series. And so there was all this turmoil which led to the appointment of Kennesaw Mountain Landis as Commissioner of Baseball. And again, I can't, for the purposes of today, I can't really get into that, but I devote an entire chapter to all of that in the, and you wonder, was Stoneham was leaving the chaotic world of investment, thinking he wanted to get into the rhythms of baseball, so a sport he loved, and it was going to be regular and everything was, and lo and behold, he throws himself into a new position, and it's completely topsy-turvy, with the entire sport being ripped apart by all this uncertainty and the fighting among the owners and who's going to control baseball. And it all becomes quickly resolved over a period of about 4 months, where they appoint Kennesaw Mountain Landis. The owners agree to this, and he becomes the commissioner of baseball. So that smoothed everything out. But then the good part about the early ownership is that Stoneham was the beneficiary of an amazing run by the Giants. In 1921, they win 4 straight National League pennants, and 2 of the World Series were against the city rivals, the Yankees, who were tenants, by the way, at the time. They were playing their games in the Polo Grounds, so they were tenants of the Giants. And so they were both 1921 and 22, the Giants beat the Yankees in the World Series, with of course Babe Ruth being the big draw there. And then in 1923, the first series played in Yankee Stadium, the Yankees returned the favor and won that. And then in the 4th World Series they were in, they went to Washington, D.C. to face the Senators, and that was a very dramatic series. But at any rate, Stoneham's wonderful success initially as a baseball owner was suddenly called into question by a lot of things that were unraveling with his selling of his business. He decided to get out completely from the investment business, and in doing so, he sent his clients letters telling them that their accounts were going to be transferred to various brokerage houses. Again, brokerage houses that dealt pretty much the way Stoneham did, as kind of, you could get in on margin and so on, so it's more risky. Again, I apologize for so much here, but there's another full chapter of all of this, but suffice it to say that in the process of all this legal hassling, 2 of the firms fail that he sent his clients to, and involves all kinds of court trials and civil trials. And then eventually Stoneham finds himself in criminal court as a result of these decisions. One indicted for perjury, and the other, we could go to the next slide, please. And again, indicted for mail fraud with 2 different firms. And so Stoneham had 2 different sets of lawyers. And in both cases, he was acquitted. The first was a real acquitted. He was acquitted in a trial for the mail fraud, but the perjury was, they decided not to follow up on it. So, but the important thing to say about this is it's very interesting material and very complicated, but Stoneham was willing to fight back, and he had deep pockets and he had a resolve. He always wanted to sort of, confront this, and he was a strong character who had the resources to sort of, fight back. He also had some help from Tammany Hall, and that is again all in the chapter about his legal difficulties. My point here is that the legal difficulties separated him from his baseball team. So from 1920, let's say late 21 to about 1927, 26, he's being distracted by all of his time in court. He's just always involved in these cases. He stepped back from the baseball as much as he could. And you could see that this was really a difficult time for him. Once the cases were settled, he came back into the business of baseball. And in 1927, he and John McGraw eventually convinced Rogers Hornsby to sign as a Giant and have a good year. And they were trying to basically challenge Ruth and the Yankees for the fans of New York City. Again, another chapter that I can only just mention here. Okay, if we go to the next slide, I'm going to make a big leap here. And as Stoneham becomes more engaged, his legal troubles subside. He becomes more engaged. He a big threshold moment is in June of 1932, when John McGraw basically steps down after 30 years of managing the Giants and being the franchise, the face of the franchise. Stoneham and McGraw together, but it's really Stoneham's decision to bring in Bill Terry, who was a player, and make him player manager in 1932. Midway through the season, McGraw's health is failing him at this time, but he's also McGraw himself is reconsidering his effectiveness, and the Giants were in last place in 1932 when he resigned. Bill Terry managed to get them up to 6th or 5th place, but that season was pretty much a foregone conclusion. But in 1933, the Giants have great success. They not only win the pennant, but they also win the World Series against Washington Senators again. The Washington Senators were heavily favored, and Terry's had great pitching, and they managed to win the World Series. And this gave Stoneham just an amazing, I mean, he felt like he was almost out of baseball with all his court difficulties and legal issues. And then, of course, all his business with McQuaid dragging him into court again. So by 1933, he feels really that this was a time that he could actually focus almost 100%. If you go to the next slide, just for those of you who are interested in New York Giants baseball history, this group certainly knows the names here. But Terry benefited from some timely hitting, but he also benefited from terrific pitching. Carl Hubble being the ace of the team, but there were other. Tarzan Parmley was another one, and they had very good pitching, and that was what carried them in the World Series. And then the next slide, I love this slide. It's the 1933 World Series, and what I love about this slide, not the guy in the middle who sort of looks like Warren Beatty playing Dick Tracy. I don't even know who that guy is. But if you could look at Charles Stoneham's expression, now you're definitely seeing here aging, and if you look at him, he's starting to feel the effects of this disease. He had a kidney, what we call Bright's disease. They call Bright's disease, which is basically kidney failure. But I love this expression. He knows, he's so satisfied that everything's over, and he kind of has this smug but lovely smile and saying, I got through it, and now here we are in the World Series, and wow, everything's behind me. But alas, it was not, he didn't have too many more years to live. If we go to the next slide, please. So this is 1935, one of the last photos taken of him. Unfortunately, 1935 was the last year that he could even come to the ballpark. By the summer of 1935, Stoneham's really feeling the effects of the kidney disease that he has. And an interesting moment here that we can close with this picture, but I want to close with a little story that in 1930, he started grooming Horace Stoneham to take over the club in 1932 by bringing him into the front office. Now, prior to that, he made Horace Stoneham basically learn how to learn Major League Baseball ownership from the ground up. He put him in charge of tickets. He put him in charge of facilities. He handled polo grounds maintenance. In other words, all through those years, he was really he could have been, promoted to the front office easily, but Charles Stoneham wanted him to learn the business from the ground up. And in 1932, he brought him into the front office to teach him how to do trades and player personnel while John McGraw was still involved with the club. But in 1935, Charlie Stoneham is no longer able to go to the meetings. And it's the first time that the owners see that there's a new face representing the Stoneham family, and that is Horace, who at the age of 32 was the youngest owner in the room. And he was with Bill Terry as well. But there was Horace in the place of the father. The father, meanwhile, is in New York City. And by the way, the father moves back and forth. They move from Jersey City, and he moves to Manhattan while he's a young investment man. And then after, in the middle of the jazz age, he moves back to Jersey City with his wife, Hannah. And he is also living with another family. That's another complication I'll mention just briefly in a minute. But he calls Bill Terry in early December, mid-December, just prior to Christmas, and tells him that he needs to go to Hot Springs, Arkansas. There's a resort town there that it's a place for cures, that he wants to go there and take advantage of the restorative waters and the kind of treatment. And he says he has three demands. One is he gets his doctor. He told Bill Terry, I want you to bring my doctor, have him ready when I get there. And number two, you have to make arrangements for Alfred, my African-American butler, first right-hand man, assistant. He has to be able to get in the hotel with me. And of course, there were Jim Crow laws down there. And the third thing is, I don't want anybody to know about this. Nobody, not even Horace, my son. He says, and Terry was, listened, and he said, when do you want to do this? He said, I want to do it now. I want to do it as soon as we can get tickets. So Terry comes from his hometown in Memphis, takes Stoneham in late, just before Christmas of 1935. The three of them managed, it must have been a hectic experience for them, the travel of the holidays and a sick man making the way to Arkansas. They get there, and then basically it's palliative. There's no chance that Stoneham's going to really recover. And it's Bill Terry was quite affected by all of this, the secrecy of it, but also the suffering that Charles Stoneham went through. And then Charles Stoneham lapses into a coma just after the new year. And Terry makes a decision to basically violate his boss's best wishes that this be secret. He calls Horace in New York, and he says, if you want to see your father, you have to get here now. And of course, Horace was just dumbfounded. They get there, and they managed to get there 2 days before he dies, and Bill Terry leaves. And Horace sees his father, and he dies. Charles dies in Hot Springs, Arkansas, and then Horace brings the body back to Jersey City, where they have a funeral. The funeral is completely secret. Only 7 people, eight mourners, including his wife and a few others in the Giants organization. The family requested that Major League Baseball not come. They sent a message to all of the owners saying they didn't want flowers. They misled the press on the date of the funeral. And it wasn't until the funeral was over that the press got the release that he died. Now, the question to be asked, since the Jazz Age funerals were these public, huge spectacles of all this, Rudolph Valentino died in 1927. His funeral they had 100,000 people on the curbs just to watch the cortege go by. Charles Murphy, the man I mentioned at Tammany Hall, died in 1925. There were 6,000 in St. Patrick's Cathedral and another 5,000 outside. I could go on more. John McGraw's funeral in 1934 at St. Patrick's was 5,000 at the altar and then another, outside. The question to be asked is, Charles Stoneham was also a Jazz Age figure and a man who's known, a public man, even though he was private in everything he did. Why would his funeral be such an anomaly? And the answer is he had something to hide. Charles Stoneham had a second family. He had established a relationship with a chorus girl in 1920. There were 2 children produced by this. now we can't call it a marriage per se. I've never seen any record, but certainly he was connected and to this family as he was with his other family. But Horace was very concerned that this might be a scene and that the other family might challenge the ownership. So at any rate, the funeral was in a way indicative of the kind of privacy and the kind of secretness that Charles Stoneham himself lived his life throughout the Jazz Age. I'll leave it there, hoping that maybe we can, first of all, let me apologize for how abbreviated and abrupt all of this is, but I'm trying to cover a lot of ground and to give you a portrait of this fascinating individual. But of course, I can't do justice to the work that is in the book. So I think I'll stop there and hope that some of the questions might illuminate the various, very sporadic and jumping around that I've done. So I apologize for that in advance.
Rob, first of all, that was fabulous. I know the book is just out. What's the best way the members can purchase it?
I assume that, New York bookstores, I don't really know, Gary. Of course, it's on Amazon, and maybe Goodreads and some of the other websites, but University of Nebraska, they can get it through them. And I hope that I think New York City bookstores might have an interest in this because it has a lot to do with New York history.
One question and then a comment. Your other book, Home Team, is fabulous. You had so much more opportunity with the internet and just, they started in 1958. You're covering something 100 years ago. How much difficulty was this getting together?
It was a totally different kind of project. Let me say, with Home Team, the Giants were fantastic. They facilitated interviewing. I must have interviewed players and managers and owners, probably about 40 people. And that took, whenever you do that, of course, it takes a lot of time. But they were such a support and a focus for me. I'm sorry about that. I'm just leave it alone. They were such a help. Now with this, you're quite right. This problem had to do with sitting for hours. When I came to New York City, I would go to the New York Public Library and I would read the New York Times, the New York Herald Tribune, the Sun, as many of the New York sports writers as I could to get a sense of this. And that was one thing. But then the Rupert family were just fantastic. Jamie and Kim, I came to their home in Hillsborough. They turned over all their papers. This was a great resource. The San Francisco Giants, they have an archive. Most of it is about San Francisco, but there is a fairly good slice of New York. As you know, Peter McGowan, one of the owners, you had him on your show many times. Peter McGowan was committed to honoring New York City heritage. And so under his interest, you could see that at the ballpark with all of the references to New York City baseball, but they also decided in the archives that they should have some archival material. So I was able to look at the Charles Stoneham file, which wasn't huge, but it certainly helped. So those are some of the, and of course you read a lot of baseball history, books. And I also had to read about Prohibition. I had to read about the war, and then of course all the Gatsby material, which I try to weave into this story. I had to read a lot on that. So it was a combination of digging with primary sources and then secondary sources, and then the archival material that the families allowed me to see. And the interview, of course, with Charles Stoneham's daughter was unbelievable.
Well, I think the beauty of the book is that, we all hear, and most of the guys here who grew up with the Giants, Horace Stoneham, Horace Stoneham, Horace Stoneham. So to write a book about his father, I think is really tells the whole story. And that's my feeling about that. And I
Well,
just I wanted to also, Jamie Rupert's on board. Jamie, how does it feel? Your whole family now is basically covered in literature.
Well, it's pretty shocking considering, both Rob and Steve Treader are the first ones to have written about Horace. So it's been a long time, and finding out about Charles is amazing. I will tell you, I joke with Rob that the way he wrote the book and the way he makes the comparisons to the Gatsby character, I joke with Rob that I'm now happy to say that I'm the great granddaughter of the great Gatsby, because he makes a pretty compelling case that all of as shady and intriguing and mistresses and children and the character of Charles is really a man of his age. And Rob, I think, does an amazing job of showing a person in their place and time. So, and of course, wouldn't the Giants be part of Gatsby? Come on, it's kind of fun.
So Jamie, I guess you being the woman you are, I guess Rob's next project is on Katie Feeney, or?
I don't know what Rob's going to be up to next. I'd like to make Rob a movie star personally, because I think 7 years of spending his time to know about Charles Stoneham and the years before that learning about Horace. I'm so devoted to Rob. There's anything he does, I'm a huge fan.
Gary, if I could jump in here just for a minute to what Jamie said about the connection with the Giants. When I first had an inkling that Gatsby was going to be able to shed light on Charles's personality and also the Jazz Age, I wrote to the president of the F. Scott Fitzgerald Society, and I said, I have an inkling that Gatsby may be based on Charles Stoneham, the owner of the Giants. Do any Fitzgerald characters or authors or scholars or critics, has anyone picked up on that? And he said, no one has. He said, but let me send it out to the listserv. And they did. And he said, well, a lot of them don't think there's a direct connection, but they're fascinated with this idea. And he said, you may want to know something, that the first draft of The Great Gatsby, the seminal scene between Tom Buchanan and Jay Gatsby over Daisy's affection, takes place not in the Plaza Hotel where it ended up in the final draft. It takes place at the Polo Grounds at a Giants game against the Cubs in the middle of the summer. So he said, you're on to something. Well, I did, that was just a wonderful, I guess when you're at the time the book was taking shape, I took this as sort of a note of encouragement and support. So to follow my instincts.
Again, fabulous. All right, we'll open it up to any questions from anybody. Norm, go ahead, sir.
First of all, thank you for a great presentation. I don't know, we were talking about gaps, whatever. Everything seems solid and smooth to me, and I like your shirt, but that's not what I want to ask about. You mentioned the friendship with Rothstein, who's a central figure in the Black Sox scandal, and Charles bought the team in 1919, the same year as the Black Sox scandal. I'm wondering why Kennesaw Mountain Landis didn't think about kicking Charles out because of his association with Rothstein.
Well, he did. This is a really interesting question. I think your question is terrific because it raises two issues. First of all, there was a man called Benny Kauf. He was a player for the New York Giants in the early 20s. And he was indicted for some kind of car thievery or something, and he was acquitted. But Kennesaw Mountain Landis banished him permanently from baseball just because he was indicted. So a lot of sports writers said, well, what are they going to do with Charles Stoneham? He's been indicted twice. Why will Kennesaw Mountain Landis just sit quietly and not do anything? But he didn't just sit quietly in one regard. He told McGraw and he told Charles, you have to sell your interest in the Havana Casino and the racetrack. That's the first thing. You got to decide whether you're going to stay in baseball or you're going to be a horse racing guy. So that was one condition. The second condition was, under no circumstances are you to allow Arnold Rothstein to be in the owner's box. By the way, Charles Stoneham was giving passes to Rothstein so he could go to ball game whenever he wanted to. And he was seen in the box, and he was a noted gambler. So this, of course, raised all kinds of hackles in Chicago, in Kennesaw Mountain's Landis's office. So Stoneham agreed. He agreed, I'll sell the racetrack and the casino, which he did do. And he said, I will ban Rothstein from the box, which he did do. The third business, why wasn't he permanently banned from baseball? I think I've talked to a number of my baseball writer colleagues and friends who know more about this than I do. I think it was because of the ownership business and the fact that Kennesaw Mountain Landis had more to do with players and his role as overseeing them than, in fact, the ownership. So it isn't a perfect answer. I wondered about that a lot when I was writing the book.
Well, thank you very much.
Rob, I got to say, number of the people on board tonight took a tour of the polo grounds, and after hearing your talk, it's pretty amazing that we were at a site where Charles Stoneham was, got his beginnings there. It's just, good feeling that we were witnessing history today. So let's go to the man with the golden pipes, Mr. Taylor.
Well, first off, Rob, congratulations on the book. I hope you feel great about it. You should, and terrific job here with the presentation. One quick thing before the question. Landis created a statute of limitations on issues like was just brought up with Charles Stoneham, and it basically became his first day in office. So he excused all these things that happened before his time, irrespective of the Black Sox scandal. Yeah. But the question I had, and I'm not sure if you came across this in your research because it doesn't fit the timeline with Charles Stoneham, but till the day he died, Ban Johnson insisted that the 1917 World Series involving the Giants was fixed. Did you ever come across anything about that? And if so, I'm wondering if Rothstein may have been involved in that, if there was truth to that.
Yes, I have. It was outside my purview, of course, because I wanted to, more or less focus on Stoneham the man, and then when he got into baseball was 1919. But in doing some of the reading and then talking to people who, again, the SABR organization has a Black Sox committee, and I talked to a number of them as well, and they also brought up the idea there were a lot of nefarious characters on the Giants ball club, and McGraw himself was considered by some. Ban Johnson did not like McGraw, and it was mutual. And I think one of the reasons he didn't like him is because he always thought that McGraw was up to something. So I think that there was that would be a wonderful thing to follow up on. And I'd like to go back and do some reading on it myself. But you're quite right. There was rumors to the effect that some of these characters on the team were also connected with gambling and so on. So yes, there is that.
Thanks.
Thank you for that. Yeah.
Mr. Paul, you're up.
Well, thank you, Rob, very much. That was just wonderful. I think the fact that you got some information from people associated with Fitzgerald saying that the original draft had the scene at the Polo Grounds over Daisy may speak volumes to verify your feeling that maybe Stoneham was at least influenced, that Fitzgerald may have been influenced by Stoneham's lifestyle. And I think that's just wonderful. But the simple question I had, so when Charles Stoneham died, where was he buried? And you said it was private, so was he buried locally?
I have never visited the gravesite, but yes, he was. It was All Saints. I think I saw John Burbage's name on the list of people. John may have an insight on this, but he was. The funeral took place at All Saints Cathedral in Jersey City. It was not the same parish that Charles Stoneham was baptized in, because it's split. There was an Irish American community in Jersey City, and there were a lot of Catholics, and so they actually added a couple of churches, and one of them they added was this. He became a parishioner in this new cathedral or new church, and he was buried. Well, John may know exactly where he's buried, but he's buried in the churchyard connected with the church.
Yes, I can tell you where he's buried. He's buried in Holy Name Cemetery, right off of West Side Avenue in Jersey City. It's on the west side of Jersey City, and he's buried there. And he's also buried with his 4-year-old son.
Yes,
He's buried
yes,
there with him too.
right,
So
yes.
West Side Cemetery in Jersey City. So if you ever want to go, take the path over and take a bus. They'll take you to West Side Avenue, and it's right there.
Oh, John, I'd like to take you up on that. I'd like to see the grave.
Okay.
Is Horace buried
I'll
near
meet
him?
you in Jersey City. It's not too far from St. Peter's College, which
Yeah,
Okay,
NCAA fame last year.
yeah.
last year, right. And how about Horace? Is Horace buried near him or no?
I think Jamie's gonna have to answer that. I don't know. No, I don't, to my memory, I don't think
Okay.
Horace is buried in Jersey City.
That's true. And by the way, I'd like to go visit the grave as well with you guys, so we'll make it a family road trip. No, Pop is actually was cremated, and he resides in Hillsborough in our house. So he's still with us in the family. We haven't put
Okay.
put he or his wife anywhere but with us.
Okay, thank you.
Sure.
There are,
But I wanted to come back to the question just a minute ago about the reference to the Polo Grounds. I have one other connection, which when I was doing my research on Fitzgerald, he wrote a letter to his editor, Max Perkins, in which he said, Gatsby was he went to Paris for the last year to finish the draft, and he was sending letters back and forth to Max Perkins, his editor, and that's all been collected in a book. So you can read all the correspondence. One of the things that Fitzgerald admits doing is following the Edward Fuller case. Now, the Fuller case is the second case that Stoneham was involved in, where he was indicted for perjury. But in that, Fitzgerald followed this because he felt that Fuller's business connections and Stoneham's business connections he based Jay Gatsby's business connections on this very mysterious, shady kind of illicit bonds that were, Gatsby's often called out of the party to go to a phone to check on something. And it's never clear what he's doing, but this was Gabe Fitzgerald. So he knew of Charles Stoneham's activities in the brokerage business. And that's the key to those letters that sort of substantiate that. So that's one more connection.
there are like 10,
Can I ask you a question?
absolutely. Who are you?
I'm James Elfers. I'll be talking later in the year about
James, how are you?
Bars and about the World Tour.
James, how are you? Your name didn't pop up. We only see.
I know, I didn't put it in. I did not. I'm still new to Zoom. This is my first Zoom meeting. Anyway, I wanted to ask him about the 1924 tour that the Giants did of Europe. Was Stoneham involved in that? Because that's where John McGraw crossed paths with George Bernard Shaw. And George Bernard Shaw said he was the most quintessentially American man he'd ever met.
The answer is no. Charles Stoneham did not, because he was involved in all this legal business. But what happens is that McGraw went to Ireland and to England at the end of the 1924 World Series. The trip to Ireland was not as successful as the trip to England. They also ended up in France, but it was McGraw who took the team. Interestingly, Shaw does get back to the Polo Grounds. He's invited, and I came across a brief reference to him watching a baseball game in the Polo Grounds, probably as a guest of McGraw's, but certainly Charles Stoneham would have hosted him in some way.
Neat. Yeah.
James, thank you, and we look forward to your talk.
Yeah. My first one up is Sally Ivars, and then 1913-1914 World Tour in January or something like that.
Perfect. There are 10 chats there. I don't want to switch over to them, but do any of those chat members have a question? Or does anybody else have a question who doesn't know how to use the hand thing? Want to just raise their hand and I'll call on them. Anybody else? All right then. Rob, cannot thank you enough, and really the research and hours you must have had to put into this must be mind-boggling. And we so appreciate you coming in. And again, the best way to get the book If you're not going to a local New York bookstore, it would be through Amazon or Nebraska Press. Rob, again, we can't thank you enough.
Thank you. It was great to be on, and
Up for Rob Garratt.
yeah,
Thank you, Rob, very much.
you
That
for
was
the-
wonderful.
Rob, you were terrific.
Thanks, Rob.
Awesome.
You were great.
Thank you for the opportunity, Gary, and see your group again. I appreciate it very much.
You know, you're always welcome here. So hopefully there'll be yet another book on the horizon. You be well.
Thank you very much, Gary.
I will hang here for a few minutes if anybody wants to talk some Giant baseball. For those leaving, happy Passover, happy Easter, happy opening day.